Good afternoon. Good afternoon. It's 5:30, that's why we have to start, as per our plans. My name is Clement Sedmak and I serve as director of the Nanovic Institute for European Studies here at the University of Notre Dame. I want to welcome you all to the 2024 Laura Shannon Prize lecture and award presentation. The lecture will be delivered by the 2024 Laura Shannon Prize winner, the wonderful Rory Finnin. I like how you build up the pressure for our lecture. Rory will be introduced shortly by our esteemed colleague, Professor Romana Hook. So, welcome, Rory. May I tell you a secret? If we were to have an app rate our guests, and if the Nanovic Institute were truly assessing its guests on a scale from 1, high maintenance, to 10, really a friend, Rory would score in the 10 range. So welcome again. Dear audience, welcome. Welcome to an event which takes place in the Elizabeth Nanovic Seminar Room. Liz is present in spirit, and so is Bob Nanovic, her husband, our founding benefactors. Please allow me to say a few words about the prize. The Laura Shannon Prize was first awarded in 2010. This was the year when the iPad was released, the year of the public launch of Instagram, and the year with the first successful trapping of antimatter. I read it somewhere. It was also the year of the Laura Shannon Prize. Since even our current first-year students were born at that point, it means that it's a young prize, nonetheless with a history. The Laura Shannon Prize is one of the preeminent prizes for European studies. It's awarded annually to the best book in European studies that transcends a focus on any one country, state, or people to stimulate new ways of thinking about contemporary Europe as a whole. The prize has been created by Laura and Mike Shannon. Laura Shannon loved books, she loved to read, she loved to meet authors, and she loved the Nanovic Institute. As many of you know, our dear mentor and former advisory board member Laura passed away in 2021. May she see the fullness of life. Here on Earth, Laura's legacy continues. We are grateful that Laura's daughters, Claire and Kelly, have joined our advisory board. The Shannon family continues to be part of the Nanovic Institute. We are indebted to the family for this generous gift and the vision for creating it. The Laura Shannon Prize has become a significant part of the Nanovic Institute's mission and a way to reward and elevate scholarship, share the scholarship with the Notre Dame community, and connect jurors and a growing community of past winners. My understanding is that more than 40 of our Nanovic Institute faculty fellows generously participated in the review process for this prize circle. I would like to express my sincere gratitude to my wonderful colleagues, Morgan Munson and Grant Osborne, who have shepherded the process along with so much respect for details. The 2024 prize jury was composed of an accomplished group of scholars, or is it rather a group of accomplished scholars? We can think about it. From across the humanities. Elliot Borenstein, professor of Russian Slavic Studies, New York University. Nicola Guess, professor of German Literature, University of Basel. Heather Hyde Minor, professor of 16th to 18th century European art history, University of Notre Dame. Gregory Kuzic, professor of English, University of Notre Dame. And Susan Stewart, Everett Foundation University professor of the humanities from Princeton. As you may know, I chair the jury meeting, but have no voting rights. The jury chooses from a carefully curated short list of 5 books. I may have my hopes, but hold my tongue. But sometimes hopes become a reality. The jury for the 2024 Laura Shannon Prize in Humanities awarded the Laura Shannon Prize to Rory Finnin, professor of Ukrainian Studies at the University of Cambridge, for his book, Blood of Others. Congratulations. The final jury also awarded the Laura Shannon Prize Silver Medal to Katharina Clark for her book Eurasia Without Borders, The Dream of a Leftist Literary Commons, 1919 to 1943. The generous jury also awarded an honorable mention to Enrica Moretti's book, The Best Weapon for Peace, Maria Montessori, Education and Children's Rights. Congratulations to these amazing authors for their amazing books. You're a lovely audience. You're a lovely audience. We are very grateful for the jury, for their work. Without a jury, no prize, but obviously without prize-worthy books, no jury. And without the Shannon family as part of our advisory board, no prize process and jury. And without the Nanovic Institute, no advisory board. And without the advisory board, no advice. And without advice, we would be lost. And furthermore, without Romana Hook, no event tonight. Professor Hook, I call her Romana, is a wonderful colleague who deeply cares about Ukraine, as wonderful people sometimes do. Romana is a beloved faculty fellow of the Nanovic Institute, and we are honored to have her as a colleague. Romana is a tenured faculty member in the English department, working on modern and contemporary British and Irish poetry, transatlantic postmodern poetics, Black British poetry and poetics, lyric theory, phenomenological thinking, philosophy of religion, and theopoetics. Of course, she has published books, and of course she has impressive degrees from the best academic institution ever. And of course, if you have written, as Romana did, a book with the title Rewriting the Word God, you will have to have much wisdom, much courage, and many skills. One of Romana's many claims to fame is the establishment of a cross-border course. She has been teaching with her husband, the very and wonderful Peter Holland. It is a course on drama and poetry in Ukraine at war, where Romana, with the support of Notre Dame's Learning's Office of Digital Learning and Notre Dame Studios, teaches Notre Dame students on campus and at the same time Ukrainian students from the Ukrainian Catholic University in Lviv. Her innovative approach allows the students from the two universities to experience poetry and drama written in Ukraine since the 2014 Russian invasion as a single community. Romana, thank you so much for being with us. And a word about the choreography. Romana will introduce Rory and the book. Then Rory will give his Laura Shannon Prize lecture, which will take between 41 and 43 minutes. After that, we have some time for Q&A. We will end at 6:40 so that we can use the final 5 minutes to officially bestow the award on Rory Finnin. Dear Romana, it's a pleasure to have you with us. May I please ask you for your introduction?
Thank you so much for that, Clemens. You raise my energy levels whenever I come within 10 feet of you. I was honored when asked by the Nanovic Institute in the summer of 2023 to read Rory Finnin's book, Blood of Others. Rory Finnin's book. Goodness. Doppelganger. Blood of Others, as a potential candidate for the Institute's prestigious Laura Shannon Prize in Contemporary European Studies. I wanted to read the book anyway, so it was nice to get it for free. And I was that summer getting ready to teach the course that Clemens just began to introduce, a new course in ND's Global Classroom about drama and poetry in Ukraine since the invasion of Crimea. Team taught with professors at Ukrainian Catholic University for a classroom of screen-connected Notre Dame and UKU students. Some students from that course may be here. And we're running another one this fall, so they also may be in our audience. But I do know for sure that overseas, the professors at Ukrainian Catholic University and some of our students are watching this event today on live stream, despite the 7-hour difference and the fact that there it's tomorrow. And that's because we've been doing the very thing Professor Finnin asks us to do in his lecture's title, talk about Crimea. Its centrality not only geographic to developments in the Black Sea region, and its long not talked about shocking history of ethnic cleansing by Joseph Stalin, who in 1944 systematically expelled the Crimean Tatars from their ancient ancestral homeland to special settlement camps in Central Asia and Siberia, many of them disconnected from their families or killed. The Ukrainian poet Boris Chichibabin, horrified as he was by Soviet presentations of the cleansed peninsula as a Russian Riviera, wrote way back in the early 1960s in a poem titled sarcastically Crimean Strolls that new Riviera was nourished by the blood of others. What makes Prof. Finnin's book by that name so special for literary scholars like myself is that it reveals, along with so much else in his study of this long-cloaked atrocity, the key role that a whole network of such poets played in getting the word out and in engendering widespread sympathy for the Tatars in their audiences, most often reached by underground means. Chichibabin's wife-to-be, for example, present when he read Crimean Strolls in Kharkiv in 1963, wrote afterwards that it shocked her because, quote, she knew nothing about the deportation of the Crimean Tatars. No one knew anything about it, she wrote, and the revelation inspired her to circulate the poem throughout the Soviet underground. As Prof. Finnin puts it so economically in this beautifully written book, quote, Stalin had condemned the Crimean Tatars to distant exile. Literature helped to keep them close, playing its part toward their eventual permission to return home. Quoting prominent literary thinkers in the West, from Wayne Booth to Richard Rorty, Prof. Finnin more broadly reminds us of the many claims that literature's ability to thus create felt proximity to human others, to expand an empathy circle, as one critic calls it, helped facilitate the rise of human rights and quell violence in the modern era, given its appeal to what Steven Pinker more recently has called the better angels of our nature. Or, as Prof. Finnin summarizes it in another hopeful and indeed poetic sentence meant, I think, to be juxtaposed with his book's title, these critics argue, in other words, that reading stops bleeding. What I didn't know way back in the summer of 23 as I was reading Rory Finnin's book for this prize was that it had already won 2 others and would win 2 more right after I recommended it for ours. The Blood of Others has had profound cross-disciplinary impact, and that's clearly evidenced by the range of associations awarding it all these prizes, from the American Association for Ukrainian Studies, to the Association for Slavic, Eastern European, and Eurasian Studies, to the Association for the Study of Nationalities, to the University of Southern California's Book Prize in Literary and Cultural Studies, to our prize in Contemporary European Studies from the Nanovic Institute. Rory Finnin is visiting us from Cambridge University, where he is professor of Ukrainian Studies, though he started life just down the road in Cleveland, Ohio, and still retains his Midwestern charm. Our time with him discussing the Cambridge Ukrainian Studies program he launched in 2008 and its many successes has already been inspiring, and we in the Nanovic Institute's Ukrainian Hub look forward to more fruitful collaboration with him to come. Please welcome to Notre Dame and to the podium Rory Finnin, winner of the 2024 Laura Shannon Prize.
Thank you so much, Romana, for such a generous and warm introduction, and thank you for the exciting work you're doing with our friends and colleagues in Ukraine, particularly at the Ukrainian Catholic University, who, like Professor Volodymyr Zelensky, who's here with us, inspire us every day. I'm just so honored and privileged to be included among the likes of Mark Antliff, Rosemary Hall, Erica Moretti, and of course the late Katerina Clark, whose work on the Soviet novel inspired us all. I am deeply grateful to the Shannon family for making this prize possible, for establishing this prize, for thinking of a way of encouraging us to advance the borders of European studies, both with scholarship in the humanities and in history and social sciences. And I'd really like to thank you, Clemens, Morgan, Gordon, Will, Becca, the entire team at Nanovic for such hospitality. I mean, one of the great gifts that they don't tell you about in this prize is that you get to spend time and feel like you're a part of the Nanovic, Keough, and Notre Dame families for a few days. And speaking of families, by the way, I want to thank my wonderful mother and father, Paul and Farrell Finnin, for their support and care. In fact, my mother recently walked me through our family tree and pointed out all the Keough in our family, and we were looking for Nanovic, and we haven't found them yet. But I'm certain they're there. But the point is, I feel very much at home. So thank you for that. I went to Catholic school for 16 years, 8 years with the Jesuits. So perhaps it's because I'm back at this wonderful institution of Catholic education that I feel like I have to make a confession. And the confession is that I struggled mightily with this title that Romana mentioned. Usually in a lot of academic titles for books and lectures, and students, you've probably seen this, there's usually a colon somewhere in the mix, right? So it's usually leveraged somewhere between a really powerful quote, a really well-known quote, and then, of course, some descriptive text. But for the life of me, I couldn't come up with any such title. No clever-sounding language really came to me because I was really moved and couldn't shake the urgency of a very simple need, our collective need to talk about Crimea, 10,000 square miles upon which, like the rest of Ukraine, the future of Europe rests. But here in the United States, and indeed in the United Kingdom, the urgency about Crimea, about Ukraine's autonomous republic of Crimea, is sometimes hard to grasp. We can see that. It struggles to overcome the political noise, the intellectual haze, and it really, I think, is struggling to overcome what is now, I think, very disturbingly a banalization of Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine. We've normalized it in our media discourse. In the recent vice presidential debate, not one question was asked about Ukraine. And I think partly this is due to two maladies, two illnesses that have calloused our senses over the past 2 years. One is a collective amnesia, and the other is a collective blindness. The collective amnesia began to set in 2014 in the immediate wake of Russia's annexation operation to seize Ukraine's autonomous republic of Crimea by military force. And we need to remember this was the first violation of the so-called territorial integrity norm since the drafting of the UN Charter. Prominent international relations specialists began to set the tone by declaring in the pages of the New York Times, for instance, quote, that Crimea is surely lost to Ukraine for good, unquote. Such categorical hot takes set in as groupthink, and they did so very quickly, casting as irrelevant simple facts of geography. So I have a map here for those of you just needing a refresher on where Ukraine is today and a few dates that are key, and I'll return to them. So I don't want to hop over this slide and distract you. But I do want to just remind you that Ukraine and our knowledge of Ukraine is something that has slipped over the centuries. And in fact, if you look at European maps in the 16th, 17th century, European audiences, readers, consumers knew more about Ukraine arguably than we do now. And here's an example of the kind of map that was cast as irrelevant by this groupthink that I mentioned. This is a map by the French military engineer Guillaume Beauplan, drafted in 1639, so it's called the Tabula Geografica Ukrainska, and it's really, as you can see, kind of a draft. So this is a draft in a series of maps that would be even more ornate and detailed and very popular in the 17th century that Beauplan was responsible for. But as you can see here, he testifies to an abiding reality, something that has been borne out over centuries, and that is Ukraine and Crimea are in the same frame. Soviet politicians, Russian Soviet politicians, in fact, repeatedly attested to this fact, and I'm quoting one here, that Crimea is a natural continuation of Ukraine's southern steppe. Now, this map may seem a bit confusing, and this is a early modern map, and the tradition often was to put the south at the top and the north at the bottom. So let's make this a little clearer. If you flip it and then overlay a map of modern Ukraine, you see that Beauplan centers Ukraine perfectly as an object of knowledge, an object of fascination, contouring its borders very similarly along the lines of we know the country now. So this collective forgetting of Crimea and its importance accelerated when the Russian Federation continued this invasion in eastern Ukraine, an invasion by installments over the course of 2014 that continued. This was an invasion of the Luhansk and Donetsk oblasts, often referred to sometimes simplistically as Donbass. We rarely connected in our analytical discourse the annexation operation to this asymmetrical invasion in the east. They're only a few hundred miles from each other. And so a curtain fell over the Black Sea Peninsula as the Kremlin turned Ukraine's own territory into a hinge of expansionist aggression, militarizing political and social institutions, and above all, militarizing consciousness itself. And as we witnessed, there was a crescendo 2.5 years ago, If in February 2014, Russia's war began with the military seizure of Crimea, it escalated in February 2022 with a full-scale invasion launched in part from Crimea. As Volodymyr Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, as well as Crimean Tatar activist Nariman Jalal puts it, quote, "The Russian war against Ukraine and against all of free Europe began with Crimea, and it will end with Crimea and its liberation." And military steps towards this Ukrainian liberation are underway, but we are very much in the habit of not seeing them. So to this collective amnesia, we need to add collective blindness. A blindness in our scholarship and media coverage to what's taking place in Crimea and the Black Sea. These achievements were unimaginable only months ago. Ukrainian forces have destroyed roughly half of the naval tonnage of the Black Sea Fleet, the Russian Black Sea Fleet. It's also harassed and degraded Russian military assets and forced most of the Black Sea Fleet, in fact, to relocate to Novorossiysk, a deep sea port on Russia's sovereign, internationally recognized territory. So these maladies, these illnesses, these cases of amnesia and blindness, I think are symptomatic of a broader disease and one we need to confront, and I'm glad to do it here. It's our long-standing failure in the academy to confront deep-seated Russian imperialism and colonialist aggression in our scholarship and in our politics. This is what we might call an acquiescence to Russian reflexive control, even in this country, that has us in the grip of narratives of greatness and great power, rather than the sway of subaltern, minoritized voices, Crimean Tatar voices, Estonian voices, and of course Ukrainian voices that have long warned us of a threat to our own collective security now. It's important for us to acknowledge that Russia today, not in the 19th century, not in the 18th, Russia is an expansionist land empire. And Crimea is arguably the territory freighted most with its colonialist fantasies. And those colonialist fantasies boil down to 4 words. Krym iskona ruskaya zemlya. Crimea is eternal Russian land. So my book, Blood of Others, is a comparative cultural history of Crimea that tells a much different story. It tries to excavate voices of resistance against this colonialist aggression, particularly among the Crimean Tatars, Ukraine's indigenous Sunni Muslim people, and it tries to listen to the way that these voices speak to each other across linguistic, religious, and ethnic boundaries. And more often than not, these remarkable exchanges take place in a way that we might not expect. That is, they take place in a figurative, imaginative mode. That is, they use poetry and prose to empower diverse readers to connect with each other despite massive differences and massive distance. So today I want to excavate some of these voices with you, voices again that I think have been hidden and obscured by imperial power and by our fascination with it. And in the second part of the discussion, I would like to try to showcase voices that are under Russian occupation today, particularly in Crimea. These are voices that we don't see in our media coverage and that we don't hear in the White House. In the book, I define solidarity as an active convergence of interest and fellow feeling that bridges a distance. So it's some of this distance of our own with Ukraine that I want to overcome with you today. So I'm going to begin with this image, and it might seem like a strange place to begin because it's an image of Catherine II's journey to Crimea, originally painted by Ferdinand de Mays. It's a widely copied painting that presents Russian Empress Catherine II's journey through Ukraine to Crimea as an odyssey of splendor and triumph. She very much is a personification of empire on the march. And indeed, as many of you know, in May 1787, Catherine arrived in Bakhchisarai in the Churuk-Su Valley in Crimea, which had been for centuries the seat of power of the Crimean Khan. And with Catherine was a whole retinue of European nobility, and they remarked in their memoirs that Catherine ascended the throne of the Khan with, quote, satisfaction. It is really quite a painting. If you look closely up at the top, sitting alongside Neptune is Peter I, looking down approvingly on Catherine. But notice the Crimean Tatar woman right at the center of the canvas. She's resplendent in this traditional marama veil. Remember, in 1787, almost the entire population of Crimea is ethnically Crimean Tatar at this time. And so here in this presentation, she is an instrument of imperial mystification. Because as we know from Catherine's French travel companions, her arrival in Bakhchisarai, in fact, did not elicit the expected wonder, the expected awe. And we often hear about that, even in our own histories. In fact, one of the French sources takes great pains to note that Crimean Tatars averted their gaze. And they turned their backs on Catherine as she entered into Bakhchisarai. And this is the way one French friend of Catherine put it, that these Crimean Tatars were, quote, preserving their stupid pride even when conquered. Preserving their stupid pride even when conquered. So this painting is indeed an allegory. It's an allegory of our epistemic suffocation of voices and perspectives of resistance to Russian imperial aggression that the Academy has been complicit in for too long. And frankly speaking, in Western histories of the Russian Empire, we don't hear about this defiant reaction to Catherine in Bakhchisarai. We don't hear that, in fact, the Russian military had to invade Crimea 3 different times before the Crimean Tatars surrendered. We tend to consume 1783 and this annexation of Crimea as a seamless expansion of power, when it was nothing of the sort. Catherine's arrival elicits a long process of what we call settler colonialism, a process by which indigenous peoples are erased, effaced, and replaced. The Crimean Tatars were expelled from their homeland, and successive waves of them fled to the Ottoman Empire, particularly in the middle of the 19th century, after the Crimean War in the 1850s. At this point, even still, Crimean Tatars constituted 80% of the population of Crimea. By 1900, they would plummet to 20. So the voices of the Crimean Tatar displaced are many, and they're sufficiently loud, but we in Slavic studies don't hear them because they're not in Russian sources, they're not in Ukrainian sources, they're rather in Ottoman and modern Turkish ones. Here I want to just give you an example of a 19th century folk song published in 1970 in the Istanbul-based journal Emel. And here, it's a fascinating couplet in the middle of the poem, quatrain, 4 lines. And what this is called is a Turku poem, a folk poem. It has this AAAB rhyme scheme, and you can see the rhyme in this case being carried by the suffix maz. Bir yanımızı Moskov sardı kaçılmaz. Bir yanımızı kara derya aşılmaz. Mevlam kanat vermeyince uçulmaz. Fena müskül oldu halı kırının. In the 20th century, Stalin sought to finish what the Tsar started. In May 1944, as Romana mentioned, after the Nazis had retreated from Crimea, Stalin deported the remaining Crimean Tatar population. This was 200,000 people, mostly women, children, and the elderly, because the men were off fighting at the front. In the Crimean Tatar language, this is an event remembered as surgun, as the exile. And today it has tragic resonance, because right now, the Russian Federation is actively deporting thousands of Ukrainian civilians from all parts of occupied Ukraine. Amnesty International has labeled this rightly as a crime against humanity. Beginning on the night of May 18th, 1944, as so many Crimean Tatar families tell each other, the Crimean Tatars were given only minutes to collect their belongings. They were ordered from their homes at gunpoint. They were herded onto cattle cars at the end, the butt of rifles by the Soviet secret police, the NKVD. Those who were sick and injured, not fit for transit, were, quote unquote, and this is the word of Soviet authorities, liquidated. Those who openly defied the deportation order were shot. Emptied out were entire villages. This is one example of a rather chilling photograph of 1945 of the village Uskut, which has lost its Tatar name because the Soviet authorities erased them all. It's now known as Privetnoy. Other valleys were emptied as well. This is a photograph from 1925 of Cherkess Crimean. As you can see, a host of residences here all around the mosque. You can see the minaret in the center. This is Cherkess Crimean today. The tents here in the center of the photograph are there for a music festival. So this is completely emptied out, and when you visit this space, you have no idea that there was a bustling culture and hundreds of people living in this place. So thousands of deportees died over the course of the journey. from inhumane conditions, a lack of water and food, inhumane conditions, and vicious treatment by the NKVD. Stalin soon replaced the Crimean Tatars with Slavs, Russians and Ukrainians. And Soviet officials at the time explicitly described this project of changing Crimea's demography in a very particular way. They're very explicit about this. We see it all over the documents in the archive. This was a task of, quote, making Crimea a new Crimea with its own Russian form. Сделать Крым новым Крымом со своим русским укладом. Meanwhile, thousands of Crimean Tatars in exile perished from hunger, exposure, and disease in specposelenia, or special settlement camps, in distant exile. And there's one remarkable poet, 18 years old, named Idris Asanin, who was in one of these special settlement camps in 1944. He had just endured this horrific journey. This is what he writes in the Crimean Tatar poem that first resounds in Crimean Tatar culture about the deportation. It's called Menim Antim, My Pledge. And this is the ending. Nefret lenem günlüm taşa, kuzlarımden yaş kala. Tek bir niyet, kureş yolu. İrademe kuçkara. Men ant etem, ant etkenin izlerinden ketmege. Milletimin akı için canım feda etmege. And you can hear and hopefully feel a little bit of the cadence of this visceral emotion from Asanin. This commitment as well to the work of in-group solidarity, the way he's trying to consolidate his people who have been traumatized by this event. As Romana mentioned, this was a deportation that was shrouded in secrecy. No one talked about it. It was radioactive. And this is a poem that was used against Asanin in a trial as a very young man that sentenced him to 25 years in prison. But the text is fascinating for another reason, because there is no direct reference, no explicit reference to a knock on the door, to cattle cars taking Crimean Tatars to destinations unknown. There's only silence about the event itself, a silence that marks a space where nobody speaks what everyone knows. This is an important phrase from the wonderful historian Jay Winter. So in Crimean Tatar literature in the 20th century, the exile experience is pushed underground. It's subterranean. It's encoded in a lot of intertextual references. And I want to highlight one of these references with you. And it involves strategic allusions to the Ukrainian poet Taras Shevchenko, who himself withstood years of really arduous exile in Central Asia. So the correspondence between experience was explicit. And for those of you who are soon to be studying Ukrainian literature or are studying it now, Shevchenko's influence is everywhere. And his poetry is one that expresses a compassion for the oppressed, by the oppressed. It's a kind of transnational solidarity with the subaltern, something that is immediately visible in these two works of visual art. So among other things, Shevchenko was an extraordinarily talented visual artist. In these two paintings, you can see impoverished and vulnerable Kazakh children. Note where Shevchenko puts himself. He's literally on their side. He's always on the side of the vulnerable, and he's looking out at us with this expectant gaze. In 1961, the poet and teacher from Crimea, Yunus Temirkaya, writes a poem in honor of Shevchenko, this giant of Ukraine's culture and national identity. The poem is called Taras Shevchenko Ha, to Taras Shevchenko, 1961. Temirkaya honors Shevchenko's resilience in exile in this poem, but he also does something remarkable. He points out how much it cost him. And he uses a vivid metaphor in doing so, of misery beating the youth from his face. Shunya siltav etip olar kuvdisani, uzaktaki yat yabancı ülkelerge, yaş başından bahitsizlik ordisini, meşakhadi katli karakunde kirdinyege. So this last line says everything to a Crimean Tatar reader who's unable to openly grieve, to express grief over the loss of homeland and loved ones, because in the Crimean Tatar discourse, the deportation event is known as Karakun, the Black Day. And Temirkaya here slides the term that has only a specific reference to this experience into a poem that is ostensibly about Shevchenko, to allow the Crimean Tatar reader to start the poem again and read it about their own suffering, their own experience of having misery beat the pain from their face. Such elusiveness, for those of you who study Stalinist trauma and Stalinist culture, is emblematic of much as what we encounter in this text. Reading this kind of corpus is not unlike using sonar to plumb the deep recesses of an uncharted sea, because we only apprehend what we're looking for by way of disturbances and discontinuities on our frequency. But with the right code key, you can see in the shifting of textual ground this work of outgroup solidarity, an extension of a hand from the Crimean Tatars to Ukrainians that helps them reclaim their own agency and their own story. And over the course of the 20th century, Ukrainians reciprocated in this project. They extended their hands to Crimean Tatars in literary texts, both in the Samizdat Samvidav underground, as well as in published works. So my book attempts a kind of textual archaeological dig of this cultural site, revealing moments, for instance, in which Soviet dissidents communicated with each other about cultural texts. So this is one example of the Ukrainian dissident Vyacheslav Chornovil writing to the Crimean Tatar leader Mustafa Dzhemilev. Dzhemilev is in a prison at this point in time, and Chornovil makes a special effort to communicate that there's a novel in print published in 1968 called Malve by Roman Ivanichuk. You can see the cover of the novel over on the left, and that this novel expresses a kind of connection and sympathy with the Crimean Tatar people, and it does so because it presents the history of Crimea through the lens of the Crimean Tatars. And this was done at a time when Soviet Russian historiography was obsessed, even defensive, about presenting the history of Crimea as eternally Russian. Also want to give you an example from someone named Ivan Sokulsky, who was a young poet in Soviet Dnipropetrovsk in central and eastern Ukraine, who composed a moving poem called Bakhchisarai, again, a reference to that seat of power in Crimea. And this poem emerges from a visit that Sokulsky makes, very much like Boris Chichibabin that Romana mentioned earlier, in 1968. He's walking with friends and he's noticing the very present absence of this indigenous group. He's seeing the Crimean Tatar cemeteries, the residences that no longer hold this Muslim people. And he visualizes the night of May 18, 1944, and he focuses on it as an assault on the vulnerable, particularly women and children. Hore sirotile, hore dalenile, pelenale hore vidchai I плечі, і за ніч останню матері сивіли, і кричали діти отуди вночі. Пускаю ці гори, тільки й чужі. Земля предків, що тебе не знає, голос даний чується мені. Кров татарська вдалині ридає, серце в тузі, там на чужині. For those of you, again, who are studying Ukrainian or are about to study Ukrainian, once again, the Shevchenkian allusions are everywhere here. And this sends signals to readers and messages that they can unpack from the 19th century and the experiences over the centuries of oppression and colonization. So as I argue in the book, these kinds of texts, all of them immersed in complex ways in this Poetics of Solidarity, were part of a broader cultural and academic campaign to fortify an alliance between this Slavic people, Ukrainians, mostly Orthodox, and a Sunni Muslim Crimean Tatar people. And today this alliance is evident in the war. It's active at the front. It's defending the people of Ukraine and the Ukrainian state right now, particularly in two military units. One is attached to Ukraine's military intelligence. The other is a volunteer battalion named after the Mufti and Crimean Tatar activist of the early 20th century, Noman Chelebi Jahan. So Mustafa Dzhemilev, who was being written to by Vyacheslav Chornovil in the previous slide, he is still very active as a leader of the Crimean Tatar people, and he estimates that about 2,000 Crimean Tatars are active in Ukraine's defense forces today. So in our remaining moments, because I'm very aware that Clemens gave me a very specific 42 to 43 minute time window, I want to open up the story of resistance in the book to what is taking place today. Because in Russian occupation and in Crimea, there are hundreds and indeed thousands of people who are expressing a connection with mainland Ukraine, with Ukrainian culture, and we need to listen to them. There are partisan groups of Ukrainian citizens of all ethnic backgrounds who risk everything to speak a language of solidarity with other Ukrainians and indeed with us. Too often today in political discourse we hear about Ukraine potentially ceding territory to the Russian aggressor. Territory is a very abstract and antiseptic term because what we really mean and what really makes the moral stakes clear is what we're talking about is Ukraine giving up people. People live on territory. Giving up people is what we're talking about here. And there are many thousands of citizens of Ukraine in Crimea who see their future, their home, in Ukraine, in Europe, not in some militarized gray zone that is governed by fear and suspicion. Russian occupiers right now seek to eliminate these voices, and they also want to present to us that they don't exist. But they do exist, and they are growing in number. Every time the Ukrainian military strikes a military asset, we see more of these groups grow in number. There are two who are active, let's say, in a guerrilla war. One is called Atesh. Atesh is fire in the Crimean Tatar language. It was begun by Ukrainians and Crimean Tatars. Another is called the Krymsky Boyovy Chaiki, the Crimean combat seagulls. These groups conduct sabotage. Many of them infiltrate the Russian military to, quote, destroy it from within, and they're often involved in mapping and geolocating Russian military assets and relaying this information to Kyiv. So what I want to focus on is less those kinds of kinetic activities underground, but more of an influential informational resistance in Crimea. These are informational partisans, let's say ethical warriors, whose message in Russian to the Russian occupier is Ruski okkupanti ukhodite, get out, Russian occupiers. And more than that, these figures are invested in a project that Frantz Fanon calls watching over from below. Watching over from below. Because for Fanon, anti-colonial resistance involves disrupting what Jean-Paul Sartre and Hannah Arendt, in her own way, Sartre refers to seriality, and Arendt refers to atomization, the way in which an authoritarian, totalitarian regime makes us feel disconnected from others, the way that they make us feel lonely and suspicious of our neighbors. And that keeps us in our place. That keeps us from transgressing boundaries. Arendt writes it like this: so long as you're alone, you're always powerless, however strong you may be. So in response, Fanon preaches what he calls a practice of vigilance. And this is a methodology of taking back the built environment, the spatial material world around the occupied, and refreshing in this way more pluralistic modes of connection and solidarity. And I think Fanon and Arendt would have appreciated the work of the Żółta Strzyczka movement or Yellow Ribbon movement. And for those of you who study the history of the Second World War, this may remind you of the Weiße Rose movement in Bavaria, particularly around the University of Munich. This was a group of students who were very active in distributing pamphlets, documents, decrying the Nazi regime, calling it an evil dictatorship, defacing Nazi buildings, etc. The Yellow Ribbon movement emerges in Kherson in southern Ukraine in 2022, and it quickly spreads to Crimea, where it is still very active. As you can see here, activists photograph themselves in very prominent places in Crimea with the Ukrainian flag. They adorn posts, fences, trees with yellow ribbons, and they also adorn strategic locations with the letter Y, which you see here, the I with the umlaut. Y is the 13th letter in the Ukrainian alphabet, but it's much more than a linguistic unit. It is a letter that is not shared with Russian or any other Slavic language, so it signifies Ukrainian singularity, an identity that's original and unique. So these are the tactics of the Yellow Ribbon movement, very much, I think, active in this movement of watching over from below. Now, there's another movement, Zlamavka. And the Zlamavka movement frequently embraces, like the Żółta Strzyczka movement, poems. Now this is, I think, extremely remarkable, that under occupation, with such moral stakes before activists, they choose to communicate through poetry in particular. So, like Timirkaya, like Sokulski and others that I've mentioned here, we see an activist taking a picture of a small piece of paper with two words, as you can see here. Boretisia poborete. And the second line, of course, has really special meaning in this institution. Vam Bog pomahaya. God is helping you. Fight, you will prevail. God is helping you. This is a poem from 1845 by Shevchenko that every Ukrainian reads as meant for them. But on the surface of the poem, it's actually directed to the Muslim mountaineers, the Circassian mountaineers who were fighting back Russian conquest in the 19th century. By the way, Zlamovka is a bit difficult to translate. It means angry nymph. The nymph being a mythological creature in Ukrainian folklore, a beautiful siren with a garland of flowers in her hair who lure men to their deaths in forests. So the Zlamovka movement here takes special aim at the colonizers' world of signification. And this is a world described by Fanon in a very peculiar and important way. He calls it a world petrified, a world of statues, crushing with its stoniness the backbones of those scarred by the whip. So notice what these activists do to fight against this stoniness. They use the fluidity, the flow of language, and they use poetry. This monument, by the way, some of you may recognize it. It's in Sevastopol. And this is a monument to the so-called sunken ships. So this was erected by the Russian Empire 50 years after the Crimean War to commemorate the loss of their navy in the siege of Sevastopol. So the placement here of Shevchenko's words is quite significant. Elsewhere we see activists using the poems of Lina Kostenko, who is a hero of the Shestisyatniki, the 60ers, in Ukrainian culture, an icon even today. She's still with us. And I want to show you one video posted to Telegram that shows this activist placing the poem on a doorway. Now, the poem reads, rather the sentence, Людям не те, що позакладало вуха, людям позакладало душі, which might be translated as, it's not our ears that have fallen deaf, it is our souls that have done so. So such actions remind Ukrainians that they are not alone, that bonds of solidarity and expressions of almost spiritual human connection, attestations of human dignity, keep them together, that they can flourish in the most mundane and unexpected places. I mean, this is a door in a very mundane place. But their message is that the Zlamovka activists also rely on themselves and teach them a great deal about their own work. And on Telegram, they have very recently reflected a great deal using images that describe their own activism, that showcase and represent their own activism. It's a kind of visual and diaristic introspection. I want to just give you two examples to conclude. The first depicts a Zlamovka activist adhering a poster on a wall. You can see the poster is Crimea is Ukraine. And notably also commenting on her experience. So the first thing is she's worried she's going to get caught. Very natural reaction. But she also notes how underestimated she is. Why is she underestimated? Because she's a young woman. Ніхто не дивиться на дівчину, як на партизанку. No one looks at a young woman as if a partisan. This post from January of this year, 2024, shows a woman's hand marking down the days until Ukrainian victory. And here the activist reflects on this question of despair and the necessity of patience in occupation. And she uses the example of the Austrian writer Stefan Zweig, who committed suicide in early 1942. So as you can see here in this comment, the timing is a bit off. The activist remembers that the suicide is in 1943. The point is, Zweig committed suicide thinking that, of course, Nazi future would be something he'd have to endure for the rest of his life. And so the activist is remembering that you need to hold on and remember that the occupation will end. Despair is our worst enemy, she writes. We need just to survive, preserve our inner freedom and faith in humanity. So in our era of disconnected connectivity, where social media platforms tend to produce thought silos that are premised on the fear of the other rather than the comfort of friends, solidarity can seem like it's a rare commodity. In a country under genocidal attack, quote-unquote faith in humanity can even appear naive. But the examples today, texts of poetry and prose, and texts that showcase poetry and prose, really see little point in cynicism. They speak instead to the way that culture can empower us to keep connections with each other, despite the violence and the oppression of occupation. And I'm very grateful and deeply privileged to have the opportunity to discuss them with you today. Thank you so much.
Now we lower the level again. We have 19 minutes for questions, which doesn't mean that you can ask a question that takes 19 minutes to ask. But the floor is open. Thank you again, Rory, for this wonderful lecture.
We need people to speak into a microphone so that the Shannons who are viewing the stream can hear.
Yes. So also be mindful of the fact that the benefactors are watching. Gundi first, Oksana second.
Thank you very much, Rory. That was a wonderful lecture, and I really, really enjoyed the fact that you used poetry specifically to make your point, to bring together art and the realities of the terrible war. So that was, I mean, I shouldn't say that, but it was very, very enjoyable. So I feel a little bit like I'm not entirely sure what I'm asking, but I am asking a question that struck me as a little bit difficult throughout, and that is the problem that this is like two cases of occupation overlaying each other, and that what we are talking about here is a more complex situation. At least, I mean, it seems to me like that, I mean, even if Crimea were to, and we hope so very much, given back to a free Ukraine, there's still an older culture that is gone. So how is that, or is at least vastly, vastly diminished? So how does this play out? Is there a conflict lurking behind all this? Or the Tatars, do they still play a role in this story?
Gundi, thanks so much for your question, and I'm really glad you raised it. First of all, it's important to remember the optimism that the Crimean Tatar experience should engender in all of us. That is, for 50 years, they took part in a nonviolent movement of resistance against Soviet power. They were the most organized dissident group in the Soviet Union. We often forget this fact or overlook it. Every single dissident group in Moscow, Kiev, Kharkiv, they all learned from the Crimean Tatars. The Crimean Tatars were the most organized. They delivered informational pamphlets, and then afterwards all Soviet dissidents began to do so. They wrote in a particular kind of clinical legalistic way. After them, all Soviet dissidents did so. So this movement produced a dividend in the 1980s, and that was the Politburo recognized the barbaric act, and they referred to it as such, of the deportation, and the Crimean Tatars were allowed to return. So in the late 1980s, there's a mass movement of Crimean Tatars back to Crimea. Naturally, after 1991, the Ukrainian state is financially responsible for making these Crimean Tatars feel back at home and to resettle them. And that's what Kyiv did, invested a lot of money at a time of great poverty in the 1990s. There were always struggles with the local political elites in Crimea about this issue, however. And this is a long story that I'm happy to talk about. But the important thing here is also to understand what is called national territorial autonomy. And this is an idea that has been circulating in Ukrainian political life for quite some time. The idea is that Crimea should be given a kind of special status with the Crimean Tatars as vessels of the sovereignty of Crimea. That there's an act of historical justice that the Ukrainian state should undertake to not only return these Crimean Tatars to their home, but give them a special standing. Now, with wonderful visits with students both yesterday and today, talked a great deal about decolonization. And we, in the field of Slavic studies, have really not explored this term enough. If we had, and if we had spoken very directly about the reality of Russian imperialism and Soviet imperialism over such a long period of time, we would have been able to borrow from different contexts methods and practices of historical reconciliation, electoral quotas, and the like. But we didn't do that. And so now we're chasing this past in a certain way. And the concept of national territorial autonomy is a response. And that is a way of restoring a sense of connection, a spiritual connection of the Crimean Tatar people to Crimea. Now, for a very long time, there's been some worry in Ukrainian constituencies about this notion that the Crimean Tatars would have a special spiritual connection to Crimea that would be recognized under Ukrainian law. And indeed, a lot of presidents and leaders have talked about how this would need to involve a change to Ukraine's constitution. President Zelensky's administration has mentioned that this is being considered and has been considered for a very long time. So there is a very complex political reality here that involves the Ukrainian state recognizing this relationship of the Crimean Tatars, the indigenous people, to the peninsula. And by mentioning the indigenous people, I also want to mention the Krimchak and Karaim peoples who were also deported in 1944 in this operation. So yes, there is a more complex political situation. It's being discussed quite frequently in my experience with colleagues in Kyiv. The worry is first to win the war. And the thought is that after it is won, these decisions will be made. And I can say with great certainty, due to the fact that I've worked closely with these colleagues in Kyiv for some time, they're very serious people who understand that this is a massive undertaking, that there have been 10 years in which Russian disinformation and propaganda has really affected those who have lived on the peninsula. Not everyone is thinking along the lines of the Zlamovka activists. No one is under any impression that this isn't, in the grand scheme of things, a minority, relative minority on the peninsula. But still we're talking about thousands of people. So I think very clearly that the Ukrainian government and Ukrainian state, if this time comes, will be able to seriously deliberate and sort through these various interests and obligations, and they're already starting to.
Oksana.
Yeah, thank you. At first, I would like to thank you for such clarity on such a complex and difficult issues. And actually, I wanted to mention the fact that Ukrainian government helped Crimean Tatars to return, but it's like already spoken. And I just wanted to add some points about Zlamovka. That Mavka is like the protagonist of Ukrainian mythology. And it's also about the deep connection with the earth, because Mavka is the protagonist of Lesa Ukrainka, famous Ukrainian poet, and also like the girl who is living, this spiritual girl living, nymph living in the forest, having deep connection with it. And so it's like a metaphor for this deep connection with the earth from indigenous people who live there and who have this connection. And this connection occupiers will never have, and it's like also like additional layer. And to understand like all of this, I wanted also to refer to Shevchenko, and to understand Russian imperialism, you just need to analyze Shevchenko's poems and his support and solidarity with other colonized people and any other Russian poet, and it will be like really enough.
Thank you, Oksana.
Thank you, Oksana.
Tom?
Completely agree.
Thanks for a wonderful lecture. I'd like to hear just a little bit about how you came to your interest in this topic. And I'm wondering, is there any connection between an Irish Catholic identity in the Midwest, settler colonialism, and your interest in Ukraine?
I know there's an Irish Midwesterner who's here, in fact, who could speak probably more authoritatively to that, and that, of course, is my father, who outside his home has an Irish flag and a Ukrainian flag and an American flag on a regular basis. I was fortunate to go to Ukraine accidentally, so I was a Peace Corps volunteer in Ukraine. I've had the opportunity to talk to students about this experience. It changed my life in every way. I knew a little bit about Ukraine before I went there in 1995. I had a friend named Taras. I tried a little borscht. But when I lived in Ukraine for 2.5 years, every time I thought I had a handle on its history, or every time I thought I had a command of something of its culture, I realized that the expectations were unfair, that it surprised me at every turn, particularly when I traveled to different parts of the country, and particularly in the east and especially in Crimea, where when I used the Ukrainian language, sometimes I would see among Russian settlers an abrasiveness. But when I used it with Crimean Tatars, there was an acceptance of an opportunity to engage with me. And I asked them more about their own experience, and I learned a great deal. And that was something I was completely ignorant of. I was like all of these Soviet readers that the figures I mentioned to you were contending with. They were ignorant of this event. They were shocked by it. And that was my experience too.
Thank you. Andre.
Thank you very much. I was really thinking about one of the last parts of your lecture, and I was thinking if you could share with us what made you look there, these cases, and made you realize this wasn't seen. And if you can give us a clue or a path or something, how we can begin to see what is not seen.
Thank you. These messages and these images and these testimonials from activists, so many of them women, are on Telegram, on different Telegram channels. So you can see them if you subscribe to Zlamavka on Telegram, for those of you who may have the Telegram app. For those of you who don't have it, you probably don't want to have it if you don't have to. They, and my work with the Crimean Tatar community and with the mission of the President of Ukraine in Crimea, I was able to speak to some of these activists to learn a little bit more about their personal stories. I'm only sharing things that they have put on social media. But for me, as someone who's interested in the way in which culture and poetry gets used in acts of resistance, I was stunned when I started seeing this under these conditions in occupation. We've heard the stories of the war crimes and crimes against humanity. You know, the response that uses poetry, that finds something positive and optimistic and uplifting in the midst of that evil, humbles me in every way. So the short answer is on Telegram, and they're very active. And like I mentioned, with every strike against a fuel depot, an ammunition store, we see more people getting involved, and they sense that something like liberation is possible.
Thank you. Thank you very much. The lecture was moving and improving. I say this with very deep regret, very deep sorry. But I can almost find it easier intellectually to imagine Ukraine in the Russian Federation than I can Crimea restored to Ukraine. In present circumstances, why am I wrong?
First of all, I respect that point of view. I think our mental maps are very rigid. And we've been told a story about Crimea for a very long time. I mentioned that earlier, that Crimea has some sort of special connection to Russian culture. And in the 20th century, we consumed a lot of these ideas and narratives uncritically. But the truth is, when you begin to look at documents, as I mentioned, from Soviet authorities, if you read Politburo minutes, you see a completely different view. That is, the occupier is insecure that they have Crimea. The occupier is worried about the Crimean Tatars, who are still, after 1967, sometimes taking trains to Crimea and loitering around the homes that their grandfathers built. And there are Russian settlers in them. And you see the KGB worried deeply that this colonial settler context may blow back in a very serious way. So I think we've been told this story, and so I understand why it's really hard for us to imagine. But it was really hard for us to imagine that Russian territory would be invaded. And that's happened. Ukrainians are occupying Russian territory right now. It was said by many analysts that that territory wouldn't be held for really more than a week, but Ukrainian forces are still there. They've opened humanitarian corridors. They're tending to the needs of civilians. If you had said to me 2 decades ago that Ukrainians would occupy Russian territory, I would have said exactly what you mentioned here. That's really hard to believe. I can't imagine it. The other thing to keep in mind is that we've been told a story about Ukraine's eastern oblast for a very long time too. And what happened in the invasion in 2014 was a small, marginal group of activists who aligned with special forces from the Russian Federation. And what they were able to do was take city halls, and they were able to take public institutions and occupy schools. Most people kept their heads down. It only took a small group. And it's easy to also imagine how with this kind of partisan force, with a supplementary force from the Ukrainian armed forces, that something can change. Black swan events happen in wars all the time. We tend to think that the status quo will just continue. If you think back to the march of Yevgeny Prigozhin onto Moscow, there was about a 24-hour window when we thought perhaps the whole thing would collapse. And that just shows you how brittle the Russian Federation is politically, and how indeed the colonizer is always insecure. We just don't often see it. Thank you.
Thank you. 1.5 questions, right? You have one, another one.
Well, thank you, Professor Finnin. What about poetry and prose invites us to consider the welfare of others? And if we think of the work of translators then, in facilitating that exchange and encounter, how critical are they to developing that empathy in others?
Thank you, Gordon. I've been fascinated with this question for a long time, largely because I kept encountering it in dissident circles. And it was usually the case that, at least when in my training, it was presented as kind of natural that poets would be considered dissidents. And we talked about how really culture and poetry was the front through which dissidents were able to speak back to the state. But the question always comes down to why? Why these texts? You can be a dissident and write something that's direct, constative, that explains that there's a human rights violation that should anger and engender resistance to the person responsible or the state responsible. But instead, poetry does something interesting. It doesn't speak directly to us. Yeats used to say, it comes at us slant. And so that kind of slantness is fascinating and very economical. It cuts through the noise of mundane human life. It puts us in a different kind of frame by which we think about each other in an almost kind of spiritual, deep way. So the work of translators is very important. If you think about these texts here, it's important for Ukrainians in Crimea, in Melitopol, in Berdyansk, in places that are occupied right now. They are physically distant from each other, but increasingly they're coalescing around the same kind of message. So you'll see these types of messages in Crimea, and you'll see them in Berdyansk, and there's already a kind of sense of unity, that this resistance has something in common. And when that is in common, you can see Crimea being brought into the fold, because of course Berdyansk was a place that wasn't occupied by Russian forces before 2022. Crimea was under the watch of the FSB for 10 years. So there's something that's coalescing around this poetry. Now, I think it's important that we work together in different languages to make these kinds of texts available to others to see. Because I do think that these activists are reaching out to us as well, and they're hoping that they are seen and that they are heard. And translation is such an important practice. We don't, I think, speak of it as necessary enough. And I'm grateful to you for the work you do in that respect, and I hope that all of us across the expanses of Cambridge and South Bend, that we do more of it. And it's something that's critical, I think, right now.
Can I ask a brief question, and then you can have your final word until 6:40? So having heard this, and if we have Cambridge, Ukrainian Catholic University, and Notre Dame, how could we work together to show our solidarity with our friends in Crimea, and which kinds of activities would you recommend?
I think that's a great question, Clemens.
Thank
Wow. I think our own poetic expression, our own literary expression would be nice. Our own photographs, flash mobs. I work with my students very often on these small acts. It doesn't take much. You can see someone just nestling a little bit of poetry in the palm of her hand and showing it near a statue. We can do something similar to let them know that we acknowledge and see them. So that kind of thing is really, I think, contingent on our work with students, because students always have the energy, the vision, and the imagination that sometimes as we get older, except you, Clemens, lose over time. So I think actions like that are creative, that involve, of course, a scholarly rigor, but also kind of creative imagination, those are acts we should do together, I think.
Thank you, Professor Finnin. Thank you for the lecture. Wonderful. Okay, what we have to do now, I look so small and short next to you. It's a shame. Anyway, now the official bestowal. Peter, we need you here. So you look overjoyed and humble at the same time. This is the official. How do we want to do that?
Should we do it this way?
Yes, I mean, this is how it looks like. It's amazing. Here we go.
I'm so grateful.
Yes.
I'm so grateful.
Not really, come right in front.
To this side.
This side.
Yeah.
As long as
And
you
then
look
we see that.
short and I look taller.
Maybe switch places.
Switch place. Oh, here we go.
Hopefully we don't drop it. Oh, God.
Thank
Very
you.
good.
Thank you. Of course, the prize comes with a monetary award, which is invisible and will be given to you by an invisible hand. It's 6:41 at the end of our event. May I please remind all of us that life continues, that there's always hope. That was such a strong message, and we are so grateful also for this message, also for encouraging us to embrace solidarity. Thank you, dear audience, for joining us this afternoon. Thank you for your questions. Thank you, Rory, for your lecture. Congratulations again to the Laura Shannon Prize. Dear Romana, thank you for your great introduction. A word of thanks to all who made this event possible, our friends from Tech, Grant, Becker, Keith, Mel, and everybody who worked so hard. And a fine expression of gratitude to the generous Shannon family who made this event possible and who continues to support the Nanovic Institute in ways that make us grateful. All good wishes from all of us here, and as I like to say, enjoy the rest of the evening and the rest of your life. Thank you.